So today I'm going to talk about some work that was funded by NRCS, Natural Resources Conservation Service, where we were trialing a couple of different organic amendment methods on rangeland. I think there's been a long history of how organic amendments can be used in crop systems, so compost or biochar in crop systems. But because of the really large scope and the large landscapes, thinking about how these are beneficial on rangeland has been slower to be utilized. And a big piece of that, of course, is cost, because we are at such a large area. We've been operating on it under a couple of principles, but the first one I'll talk about, and I'll come back to throughout, is this idea that the land steward on the ground is going to know best. That probably there are areas on rangeland that are performing pretty well and that have really lots of growth and supporting diversity. The soil isn't eroding away. There are going to be other areas that have had either historical disturbance, or there was a big rain event or something that's disrupted that functioning system. And so we don't want to try to treat everything without thinking about it. We want to really target areas that might need some a boost towards a positive feedback cycle, rather than trying to treat everything the same. So that is something I want to talk about right up front, because we're not trying to go into pristine grassland and add something new. We're also not trying to restore like mine tailings where there's no native vegetation. We're sort of hanging out in the middle where it's not working as well as we think it could, and so maybe there's something we can do about it. Just keep moving the black bar, don't I? Oh, there we go. So the big picture that we're facing, of course, is legacy. In many cases, is legacies of the Dust Bowl, and so the Dust Bowl happened in the Mountain West as a result of many factors, of course. But part of it was weather and disturbance and things like that, and it was catastrophic. And tons and tons of topsoil were moved. You could see the clouds thousands of miles away, out to sea, all of this. And so we want to prevent that from happening again, ideally. And two, we're still dealing with the legacies of the fact that that did happen, that in some cases we've lost all of our topsoil and are rebuilding things that have really lost their function. So that's the really big context. That's sort of what we're facing, is preventing another Dust Bowl and recovering and building resilience to the fact that we have historical disturbance. So there we go. So in my program, the Carbon Ranch Initiative, we work with sort of two main principles, and I'll talk about them one and then the other. The first is the healthy soil principles. This diagram has 4. You will see places that have 5 or 6, but generally we sort of can consolidate into 4, where we are on this side. These 2 principles, maximize continuous living roots and maximize biodiversity, are helping to feed the soil biology. We want sugars from the plants moving out into the soil, and we want lots of different kinds of organisms processing those sugars and all those nutrients so that those cycles are being maintained. And then the minimize disturbance and maximize soil cover is we want to protect soil aggregation and that organic material. So often, and there are certainly visuals of crop examples, but these principles still apply to rangeland, where with disturbance, it's sort of the timing and intensity and rest regimes of having livestock or having wildlife. And maximizing soil cover is more on that sort of how, again, that management. When do we move things off? Are we leaving above ground biomass, or are we going all the way down to bare dirt? So while these principles really have primarily applied to croplands, because they are broad and they are related to the soil ecology, it helps to think about them in the framework of rangelands as well. And the other nice thing about the principles is it's not prescriptive. We're not saying you can never run goats or you have to change to bison, right? It's how can you make your decision that moves the needle from where you are now towards a healthier soil. And so if you align with one or more of the healthy soil principles, you're more likely to move the needle from unhealthy to healthy than you would be if you made a decision that doesn't align with the healthy soil principles. And so to me, that's really important that we're not being judgmental. There's a lot of reasons that people make decisions, and so they can be really important reasons. And so that's why I use the language of align with versus not align with, rather than you're doing a good job versus you're doing a bad job if you're not following healthy soil principles. So healthy soil principles is one of our frameworks. And again, as I talked about, the principles work because they align with how soil ecology works. So these are some diagrams out of our soil health workbook, which you can find on our website or order a hard copy on, we'll send it to you. But broadly, of course, we have the air, which even though it's tasteless and odorless, doesn't feel like anything, is actually full of stuff. For example, if there was no oxygen in this room, I would know immediately, and you all would know because I would stop talking and I would fall over, right? So there's something in here, even though we can't sense it, or we're not aware of it all the time. Of course, there's nitrogen in the air, which is not in a form that plants can use. And then of course, there's carbon dioxide in the air, which is tasteless, odorless, but so important for our food system. So again, we know this diagram, carbon dioxide and water are driven by photosynthesis to form carbohydrates, and oxygen is respired. And so that is what is feeding the rest of the soil ecosystem. And that's where, in my previous talk yesterday, I talked a lot about how soil is at the interface of a lot of different biogeochemical cycles. So just talked about the carbon cycle, carbon dioxide being transformed into plant material, which is then eaten by things or decomposed by things. And then of course, the heat energy is transferred through those chemical bonds. The nutrient cycling, where we have nitrogen, perhaps fixed by biological soil crusts. All of those are interacting in the soil at that interface between above ground and below ground. And so when we protect the surface, enhance biodiversity, all of those other soil health principles, we are helping the cycling to perform at its best. And when we do that, when our management aligns with these processes, we are more likely to build soil health, build organic material to the extent possible. All right, so the second big principle that we work under in the Carbon Ranch Initiative is this idea of how to build as much as possible circular economies. And so, which also, you'll notice, mirrors how things happen ecologically, where things are a cycle. They go from the atmosphere and into the soil and back into the atmosphere. So there's this cyclic component of a healthy ecosystem. Instead, currently, in lots of parts of our food system, there are inputs required for production, and then something is produced and it's consumed off branch, and then the waste is also dealt with somewhere far away. And so there's nothing nourishing, nothing regenerating the on-ranch part when we think about these inputs. In contrast, if we can start thinking about how we could fold that around and have some of the waste be transformed back into production, either on ranch itself, or ideally have off-ranch waste get transformed into on-ranch production. We are, again, building our management systems in ways that align with and are similar to ecological systems. And so I think one thing I would like to pose for the chat are what are some inputs that could potentially be reduced by thinking in this circular framework versus in a linear framework. I'll give people just a minute on the chat. I don't know how I'm going to be able to see it. Let's see. I might have to. Again, the question I'm posing is, what are some inputs? Oh, and now you can see my notes, can't you? Well, anyway, I was thinking that, y'all, let's see. Back to slideshow. Since people saw the answer. Some things that I was thinking people might come up with are nutrients, right? So if, you know, in a cropping system, if you're having to buy fertilizer, that's an expensive input, or seed or something like that. And then you're producing things, and then the waste is going into a landfill somewhere else, or is going into, yeah, if it's wrapped in plastic and then it can't be fed out to animals, it's just exported off the production system. The other thing is the big input that we think about is time, right? If there's waste on ranch, you sort of have to deal with it, right? The waste happens idea, right? It's going to happen. There's going to be waste. And so if you have to deal with it anyway, how can your efforts be amplified such that you're building up production, not just wasting your time? So those are sort of these two big principles. And these interact, and again, sort of relate back to some of our big picture challenges that we're facing, in that if we can think about how we divert things away from waste, how we affect the outcome, it can actually matter to climate change. So, for example, when we compare landfill to composting, in the landfill, the microbes that are favored often are going to produce methane and less so carbon dioxide. Versus in composting, there's some methane produced, and of course there is carbon dioxide produced, but it's relatively less. And when we think about methane versus carbon dioxide, the analogy I like to use is that all of these sort of greenhouse gases, sometimes they're called, are like blankets, right? So the more of the gases we put into the atmosphere, it's like we're adding more blankets. And that's what's making things generally warmer. So adding carbon dioxide is like adding a comforter, but adding methane to the atmosphere is like adding a heavy sleeping bag. The effect is much stronger on climate change. And so anytime that we can reduce methane emissions, we're going to be starting to reverse or starting to slow down, at least take our foot off the accelerator for climate change. Likewise, when we think about catastrophic wildfire versus biochar production, which I haven't told you how to do yet, how we do that yet, when we have catastrophic wildfire, of course, we have smoke, which is something that's incredibly harmful for folks with immune issues. We have lots of carbon dioxide release. Versus when we can, again, manage this system a little bit more, put in some thoughts about circular economy. We have almost no smoke, and of course we're still releasing carbon dioxide, but we're actually holding a lot more of that carbon in a solid form rather than adding blankets to the atmosphere. So this is how when we think about circular economy, it actually relates back to some of those big issues that we're facing. And then, so this is in that sort of how we produce these amendments. And then of course, in how we use them is also hopefully going to help us address some of these big problems. So this is a great paper from Riles, Rebecca Riles from 2016. It's a complicated figure. We have change in carbon, and we have a modeled prediction of year. So going all the way out to 2120. And so this black line is the amount of compost carbon that they added. And as it decomposes, it's predicted to decrease. The carbon in that is being cycled and it's sort of lost. It's no longer compost, right? It's gotten cycled into other things. What's interesting is the total carbon in the system, which is the gray dots, is increasing steadily and is maintained above the initial levels for, into 100 years. And so what that means is what it's predicted to happen is that compost addition is changing the feedback cycle of how the nutrients plants are cycling carbon and they're accumulating carbon. So not only are we, if we're making compost, we're diverting carbon away from the methane production in a landfill. If we add it to the surface, we are potentially setting it up where we're going to create a sink for carbon for decades. So again, there's really good reason and some really solid research to think that there's ways that thinking in a circular economy and thinking in the soil health principles could really address some big issues. So finally, and I put this in there because I'm anticipating questions that folks will have. So column A, column B, column C, right? What would you decide to do if you had a small cost and a pretty big benefit relative to the cost? What would you do if you had a really large cost and a relatively small benefit? What would you do if it was a high cost, but it's an even bigger benefit? I think hopefully it's pretty obvious. I can't see the chat. I'm not going to try to fiddle with it. Feel free to put your answer in the chat if you disagree that I would vote. I'm guessing that most people would say they would do the thing, they would not do the thing, and they would probably do the thing. If this benefit is important and it outweighs the cost, it's probably worth doing. And so what I hear a lot about, and getting back to that scale of rangeland and the scale of trying to put something out on rangeland, is people almost always just say, it will cost too much. And I have to say, relative to what? Currently, we don't know the size of the benefit. So if it's a big cost, but it's an even bigger benefit, then maybe it's still worth doing. And maybe not, maybe it has a big benefit, but it's not as much as the cost. But I don't think we know that yet. And this is one of our goals in the Carbon Rich Initiative, is to start trying to get enough examples where we can start to figure out, what is our ratio? Is our cost bigger than our benefit, or is our benefit bigger than our cost across different rangeland systems? All right, so with that, as I mentioned, I'm just going to talk about 3 on-ranch case studies. And the idea was just to try to scale up biochar, compost, and bale grazing and sort of see what happens. And one aspect of it was what happens if you give a rancher a new thing, right? People are just incredibly innovative and figure out how to make things work. And because, mostly compost has been used traditionally on crop systems, most ranchers don't have a manure spreader or don't necessarily have a tractor. So how would you do it if you were going to figure out how to add this? What would you do? And so that was another thing. It's the case study. It's also just, let's start, let's not top down approach, let's bottom up approach of how would we think about making this work if we were going to start implementing it more widely. So next I'm going to talk a little bit about biochar, compost, and bale grazing and what they are, but I'm going to take a tiny diversion and might just be a thought experiment since I can't see the chat for now. So go ahead and add to the chat or think to yourself, would you plant vegetable seedlings or your favorite native grass, whichever, into a child's sandbox? Would it do well? Why or why not? Okay. Would you plant your vegetable seedlings or your favorite native plant directly into a pot filled with charcoal? Would it do well? Why or why not? Would you plant vegetable seedlings or your favorite native plant directly in a pot with pure compost? Would it do well? Why or why not? And lastly, would you plant things directly into a pot filled with hay? You think they would do well? Why or why not? Hopefully, some of you are emphatically going, it depends, because it does depend. You know, different plants have different tolerances. There's things that really specialize on a sandy environment. There are things that are really good at extracting nutrients from harsh environments. There are things that really like heat. So something that's really dark and black might be very happy in there. And I'm sure you've seen weed seeds sprout out of hay bales. So there's clearly something that can grow in there. However, ultimately, generically plants need both mineral soil and organic matter, and different organic matter has different properties. And so plants need soil structure. They need how water will flow. So sand might have water flow too quickly through it. Compost might get saturated or dry out quickly, sort of alternatively. Compost might have too many nutrients and burn the plant roots, whereas hay might not hold on to nutrients hardly at all, or just charcoal, anything like that. So we do need to think about sort of how we balance mineral soil and organic matter. And we have this diagram in another workbook that is available to you all, where we think about what soil is. If you dug a cubic square of soil, it's going to be these three things. It's going to be a mixture of air and water, depending on how recently it rained before you dug it up. It's going to have sand, silt, and clay, which is sort of that inert, inorganic component. And then it'll have organic matter. And then when we add something like compost, that's what we're contributing. We're contributing the living and dead organic material. I'll just make a note that this 5% organic matter is higher than I've seen in any measurement of rangeland soil. We usually are at 1 to 2% here in New Mexico. And so just a caveat that I don't think you're doing anything wrong if you're at about 1 or 2%. That seems to be pretty common currently, but the more we can boost that organic matter, the more we're gonna be contributing to that ecological cycling in the carbon, energy, nutrient, and water cycles. All right, so back to our case studies after our little dilly-dally with why they might be important to plants. So what is biochar? I like to talk about biochar in terms of how it's made. So I'll show you the video in just a second, but in principle, you fill a space and you keep low oxygen or maybe even no oxygen in part of it, and you're using the heat from the fire to chemically transform the other organic material so that it doesn't actually react with oxygen and go off as CO2. So you're actually keeping the carbon intact in a solid form while you're chemically transforming it with heat. And that is the best I can do without being an actual chemist. So that's what's happening. And what you're left with is this really amazing chemical structure that is almost pure carbon and has really high surface area and is very inert. And what that means is it can react, it itself does not have nutrients, but it's reactive. It has that surface area so it can react with nutrients, hold on to them and release them, as well as provide spaces that microbes can live and hide and flourish. I will play this video. I mentioned that there's not smoke when we produce biochar, and it was totally astonishing to me. This is a workshop we did in February. You can see the heat, and there's just little tiny wafts of smoke, but burning this in a pile, burning from the bottom, or if you were just sort of burning this much wood in your backyard barbecue without thinking about making biochar, you're going to have a lot more smoke. Last thing I'll say is we have any day now a new workbook that we're going to release that talks about biochar production and how it relates to soil health. So stay tuned. I was excited to release that any day now. Okay, let's see. Oops. Oh, I just want to watch the video again, apparently. All right. So that's biochar. Compost. Compost is, as we talked about, really full of organic material. It happens naturally. It's a decomposition process, and so decomposition happens with microbes and larger organisms. And when we do it, we manage it sort of for optimal conditions that help the decomposition process along, and it can speed it up or it can give us a desired end state. So again, lots and lots of different kinds of microbes. There are many different kinds of composting. We can sort of talk about some of the different options, but I really like this video. You can see this compost pile steaming. So there's heat generated from the activity of the microbes in this pile, and they are what are chemically transforming the feedstocks that go into the compost pile into what comes out. So what I always think about is you toss an apple core into a compost pile, 90 days later, you would not be able to find that. It would be completely transformed. Finally, what is bale grazing? This has been used for a long time, and it seems like it's getting to be more coming back, I should say. And fundamentally, it's bales of hay are placed on the ground rather than in, sort of a concrete vessel or a bin or something. Some of the hay will not be consumed as it falls, and because of the activity of the livestock, they're going to be stomping on it, pooping and peeing on it, and together that's going to get it in good contact with the ground, as well as leaving a layer of protection on the ground. And so what all of these have in common is when we add them as a top dressing, we are addressing several of the healthy soil principles. We're addressing keep the soil covered. We're literally adding a physical barrier on top. Pardon me. In the case of compost, certainly, we are dramatically increasing the biodiversity by adding all of those microbes. And then in the case of bale grazing, we are incorporating the activity of livestock into how we're managing the soil. And then minimizing disturbance, again, this idea of doing a top dressing. We're not tilling things in, we're just letting the soil do sort of a natural process, which is sort of top down, where soil is formed on top and then starts getting incorporated into deeper layers. Keep the soil covered. That's the last one. Maintain a living root. We're not directly affecting the living root, but by increasing shade, we're helping to hold moisture in, we're cooling down that soil surface. We're providing, in many cases, nutrients, or places that nutrients can stay, can be held on for longer. So together, these amendments we think are potentially important because they align with healthy soil principles. And yeah, stay on here for one more minute. Additionally, these amendments match our second principle of trying to build in a circular economy, right? So if you have juniper that you need to clear off of your rangeland, you have to deal with that waste. You're going to have waste woody material. You can leave it in a pile. It might burn, which might be catastrophic depending on the conditions. Or you have to haul it away, right? Either way, you're having to deal with it. For bale grazing, sometimes you have to feed, supplement feed. And so if you have to do it anyway, how can you plan your management such that you're getting multiple benefits? So yes, you're losing a little bit of the hay. We want about 25% remaining. So that's potentially a big cost depending on the cost of hay, but we're building soil health. So again, if the benefits in that area exceed that of the added cost, then maybe it's a net beneficial thing. And again, it's something you have to do anyway. And then compost, again, if you have other food or manure waste, you know, and it's been sitting in a big pile and slowly leaching nutrients into a water system, you know, if we can get the microbes in there, build the conditions to chemically transform it into a slow release fertilizer, then maybe it's really going to help us in both in the health and soil principles and in making waste productive. So again, we have these principles and we want to see, are the benefits of doing this added work and thinking in that circular way going to benefit the soil health sufficiently to offset those costs? So I did this trial across 3 ranches in New Mexico, just sort of stretched across the state. I've got some Google imagery here. And like I said, we had each of the land stewards pick where they wanted to try to address something they wanted to try, place they wanted to try, right? We weren't trying to treat their whole land area. We wanted them to pick what's an area that I think could be doing better than it is now. So at this ranch, I don't know if you can see, there's these berms that were probably put in the 50s. There were probably some old fields here. And what's happened, of course, adding the berms, is that the upslope side accumulates water, and then the downslope side is completely desiccated and has almost no plant material. So this was a place where, you know, it's not doing as well as it could. Dropping down to Weaver Ranch, I don't know if you can see these perpendicular dunes. So these are old fields, and these were the fence lines between fields that had gotten so severely eroded in the Dust Bowl that these dunes are in some cases 11, 12 feet high. And so trying to restore the inner dune area and build soil up from the subsoil is a real challenge. And so that was what they were interested in working on. And then Santa Ana Pueblo just has a sandy, highly erodible area that they were interested in addressing. Great. And so where did we get this? For the Bale Grazing, again, what happens if you ask ranchers to figure things out? They do it. So Bale Grazing, it was finding a local place to purchase, so reducing transport costs and trying to support the local community. Biochar, we couldn't figure that out over the time scale of this grant. So we purchased super sacks from a commercial dealer. They were delivered in a trailer. I'm going to note that these were inoculated with a compost tea. We can talk about that later, but adding pure compost can potentially compete with plants for nutrients. And so you don't want to do that. I have curiosity about how that could be used, but that's another talk for a future day. So these were delivered on a trailer. Something that was told that everyone mentioned was really annoying is that, one, they didn't know when it was going to be delivered. And so it was sort of like sitting around and waiting for this trailer to show up. So that is something, if you're thinking about this, to really think ahead of, like, how flexible are you? Who's going to do your delivery? How is that going to go? Anyway, and then in one case, just where it got delivered, these super sacks are really heavy if you don't have heavy machinery to move them. So thinking really clearly of where they can be stored short term before you actually use it. The compost was locally. So on Santa Ana, there's actually, they've already started building an on-site composting facility, partnering with the horse rescue that's there. So they have composted horse manure. The other 2 sites, we partnered with Polks Valley Farm. They have a swine farm, and they take waste from nearby city, Albuquerque. They feed it out to their pigs, and then they compost the food and pig waste together. So again, that example of how can we build circular economies, not just on farm, but spread out to the larger region. Polks Valley is a really excellent example of how they're thinking that. So how is the material spread? This grid gets, I of course find it really interesting to look at, but I'm keeping it in a grid in case you're particularly interested in something in Moore County, or if you're particularly interested in biochar. So I left it in a grid just so you can sort of pick which axis you're most interested in. But so again, you ask ranchers how to do something, you'll come up with a couple of different innovative ways. For bale grazing, this was flake spread in goat pens along a head cut and on the berm. For Santa Ana Pueblo, they used the really large bales, and that was actually the image you saw right here. And so the cows sort of tore it apart themselves. Versus Weaver Ranch, that actually got round bales and rolled it out. And so they had to really be managing to pull those cows off because it was already sort of a thin, long layer. So interestingly, the biochar, Weaver borrowed a manure spreader and tractor. So again, thinking really innovatively, you don't want to buy one, but maybe someone down the road has something you can borrow. So these guys borrowed a manure spreader and tractor. Santa Ana had a forklift available on their site and put the biochar bags in the back of a truck, and one person was slowly driving and the other two shoveled, right? They also, interestingly, were really excited to understand grazing and ungrazed impacts, so they added exclosures, actually, so they could continue to track how the cattle related to these amendments. And then Soul Ranch, this is a good thing to note also, they didn't have any heavy machinery to lift the bags. So they actually had to like double shovel everything so that they could move the super sacks. So anyway, so this was definitely a trial and error process. But we want to present this all to interested people so that if people are interested, you can be thinking ahead to some of the trials and tribulations that we learned. Finally, compost. This was our friends Polk's Folly have a hydraulic trailer. So they drove slowly and lifted the hydraulic trailer slowly. Really helpful is cows get real curious and sort of snuff and kick it around a little bit. And then they used a riding mower to further spread it, or rakes. And then finally, Santa Ana used a manure spreader and tractor. So what did this look like? So of course, because the different methods were slightly different, you got really different impacts. So for bale grazing, the throwing out the flakes and rolling out along bale resulted in a really long, pretty continuous linear strip of this organic material addition, versus Santa Ana, where you ended up with these sort of 30 feet diameter areas with intense addition of the bales, but not as much impact around that. But when you do that often enough, you sort of get this grid of added organic amendments. So the biochar, shoveling it off with a shovel results in a pretty thick layer versus the manure spreader, where it's really kind of a dusting, which is really interesting. And then compost, when you run it out with a hydraulic trailer, again, you get that long, these two are both that hydraulic trailer, you get that long, narrow strip, about a car length wide, versus the manure spreader, you get it more thin and spread out more widely. So, double check my time. How did amendments affect soil health? Again, we were operating under, we want to be incorporating the biology and the systems of transformation to do the work for us, so that we don't want to be adding organic amendments year after year. We want to jumpstart some positive feedbacks so that we'll have that long lasting impact that Ryle's modeling predicted. And so one really nice holistic measurement of soil health that I like to use is aggregation, soil aggregation. the viewer my talk yesterday, you know, I often think like a raindrop, or I think of that impact of that first raindrop. And so in this test, we put really small pieces, about, you know, less than a centimeter, on this little dipper, and we immerse it in water, which is sort of analogous to what happens when water is encountering that very surface of the soil. Is it going to blast apart the soil structure and let that erode away, or is it going to suck it up like a sponge? And so running this aggregate stability test tells us a little bit about how that soil is going to function in a rain event. But it's also related to all of this biological activity, because the more life that's in the soil and at that soil surface, the fungal hyphae, the microbial colonies that are exuding polysaccharides, all of that activity is going to help glue soil particles together and make it more resilient to water. And that's really different than a physical crust or a chemical crust. So a physical crust, if you have really a lot of clay soils, those clay particles will stick together quite well, but it's not necessarily the same as a biological activity that's holding it together. And the chemical crust, if you have a salt crust, it might perceptually look crusty. You could break it apart and lift a piece up, but as soon as that salt is dissolved, then that structure falls apart. So I really like the aggregate stability test for how it relates to the biology that's happening in the system, and it tells us a little bit about what might happen with that infamous first raindrop. So as with yesterday, this is all very cutting edge, and so we're still processing the data, and actually just finished collecting it sort of a week and a half ago. So I'm just going to show two of the sites right now. So looking at this graph, we have two of our sites, Seoul and Weaver. Here's our aggregate stability metric. They are ranked from 1 to 6. The blue bars are our control sites. Yellow is Bale Grazing. In the case of Soul Ranch, we don't have that data back yet. Black is the biochar additions, and brown is the compost additions. And what you can see, even from just these two sites, is a really strong effect of adding compost, where we've increased aggregate stability over 50% and almost 30% in just 1 year adding compost. Whereas the other amendments aren't having an effect, or we don't know yet for Soul Ranch so far, but for that really holistic response, we're seeing a strong response to compost addition. We are looking at many other things. We're looking at the cover across the soil surface. So how much plant growth is there, and how much is it covering, as well as the above ground biomass. What else are we looking at? I should have put a slide in here. Anyway, we are looking at other things, but because we're talking about soil health, this aggregate stability response is really neat. But I also want to show just sort of what it looks like. Can you even tell when you walk up to these plots if there's something different about them? Would an alien arriving on the planet think, huh, what did they do here? So this is all at Weaver. All of these green areas are all in a Bale Grazing strip. So this Bale Grazing strip ran right through here. And so there's something that's favoring this forb growth, this late season forb growth. So I would say, yes, visually we could walk up and we could tell where the bales had been laid out. How about the compost? You can see from much farther away where we put the compost. Here's this line of compost addition running across the screen here. Unfortunately, these are all tumbleweeds. In this case, it was a good tumbleweed year. In a lot of cases, folks, the ranchers that we've worked with, they would rather have perennial grasses, but in places that are really degraded, having some vegetation is acceptable, especially like kochia that's actually palatable. People are excited even to get that going. So it's not ideal, but it's not the worst. The other thing I'll say is so far in our amendment trials, we haven't found any new invasive species. We found things that are already present on the landscape become more abundant when you give them more nutrients and more resources. But we haven't sort of introduced something new and noxious. The biochar is a little bit harder to see. There were a couple of folks noticing individual plants that seem to be doing better, but this one was a little bit harder to just walk up and know that you were in a new place, that we had done something there. So so obviously we have a lot more work to do, which is to sort of finish all of these analyses and get that cost analysis. So what did we pay? How big is our impact across some of these different responses? But moving forward and more broadly, these two ways of thinking, thinking through healthy soil principles and having a more circular system, are being supported by some of the new treatment or new practices that are coming available. So for example, already on the books is a woody residue treatment. So if you're thinning juniper to promote grassland, you could get paid or cost share for that treatment. And there's a new enhancement activity, which is biochar production. So there are now, it's moving towards where things are, they're making it easier to implement these on larger scales. And finally, there's a soil carbon amendment. It's been an interim practice that about 12 states have adopted, and it's up for national review. It's currently in the Federal Register as 336. And so I think we're sort of at any day now we'll hear where it's landing, whether it's gonna, how it's gonna be rolled out. And so that again, that there's gonna be support from USDA for getting some more of these amendments out. And then of course, California is really pushing all of this. So I'm just gonna end, wait, I wanted to take just about an hour, so we have lots of time for chatting. Considerations and lesson learned so far. Again, I said it right at the very beginning, all of these trials are on managed lands, right? We're not going into pristine grasslands. We are making sure that the livestock are being managed, right? Whether it's bale grazing and pulling them off so that there's enough left, or yeah, that if there were weeds that popped up, we could move the livestock in and hit it really hard before it goes to seed. This was on managed lands. And another thing that a lot of the stewards were interested in was there's a real interest in protecting from wind and water erosion. And also, because this is a large-scale trial, we want it to be far enough away from riparian areas that any leach nutrients or something aren't going to affect the sort of key areas. So this was very much in the uplands. As I mentioned, in the 50s and 30s, well, there have been berms created across New Mexico, and that was something that everyone has noticed that it is having a big impact now. And so hopefully the work that we're doing now on organic amendments are going to have positive future effects rather than us being like, oh man, I'm sure these people were doing what was best at the time, but created some negative feedbacks for the people who are stewarding now. There was also consideration, again, of like, where is the most useful place for doing this rather than trying to treat everywhere? So there were considerations of wildlife habitat or places that are heavily impacted for calving or branding. So actually, as sort of as a bonus, one of the pens, they bale graze pretty intensively in it, And the erosion off of that pen since then, anecdotally, has been much less. The other consideration that I heard a lot was people were very worried about wind, right? We spent quite a lot of money on biochar that's been sieved to a small diameter. And so was it just going to blow away? And luckily, this was a trial, it was paid for. So none of the actual stewards were on the hook for incurring this cost. But people were very worried that it was just they were going to put it down and it was just going to blow away. So far, that hasn't happened. After a year, in some cases, all the way up to a year and a half, we can still go out and we can actually find our amendments. Like we can find the bales, we can find the compost, and we can find the biochar, which also means that some of them, they're not breaking down in a year, which makes sense because it's been a severe drought up until a fairly nice monsoon season. Something that I thought was really interesting, and somehow I didn't get a picture of it, but I will go out the next time, get a picture of it, post it on our social media or something, is it was really interesting. In one of the biochar, actually in two places, the biochar, it would be a little bit visible on the very top surface. I would dig in with my soil knife, there would be soil, and then there would be a layer of biochar and then soil again. And so to me, it's creating a roughness in the soil surface, which can potentially trap windborne dust. And windborne dust has a lot of nutrients and a lot of beneficial characteristics. So that was pretty exciting to me. Again, very anecdotal. And then should you or someone you know be interested in trying some of this out, one, feel free to talk to me. We have lots more than I can cover in an hour to say about this. But, you know, where do you buy things? Are you, when we sort of think holistically, carting something all the way across the state in order to build up the soil on this one landscape? Is that really going to be a net good? What is the cost and benefit of that? Versus, you know, can we start building up local and regional capacity to do some of these production side? Again, that size and properties, knowing what you're going to get. Not all compost is equal, not all biochar is equal. Was the biochar inoculated with either nutrients or sort of a compost tea? Was it sieved or not? Sorry, back to the wind idea. One of our compost was sieved. And so we were more worried about that blowing away than the other one that wasn't sieved. There was still sort of chunks of woody mass. And that actually helped to weigh it down. And again, it created it slowed down the wind, so it wasn't pulling our material off quite as quickly. As I mentioned before, where do you put it to store in case you can't deal with it right away? How do you spread? You maybe need machinery. You definitely need time. And then the sort of one key question is, how much to add? Do you want a really thick layer and really, really protect that soil surface? Or are you trying to just sort of inoculate the microbes, in which case you probably need either very little or potentially just need a compost tea or some sort of a tea where you could spread it out with a hose or something. So all of these are still the space to investigate is wide open. Would love to hear about everyone else who has tried things like this, so that we can just start to compile and get best practices and learn from each other. So that is where I will end, is that I would love for us all to learn from each other. And we'll stop sharing and try to figure out all the things I've been missing in the chat. Great. No, I've not been missing things in the chat. Phew. Okay, I was worried there for a minute. So go ahead and come off mute if you have questions or post in the chat. And I sure have enjoyed talking at you for the last hour and love to hear from you now.
Okay, I'll kick it off.
Thanks, Ed.
So your the raw biochar, is that just activated charcoal? Or what's the difference?
Yeah. And again, I am not a chemist. This is what I've learned over the last couple of years. It really matters the conditions that you make it in. Better quality is at high temperatures, and then the feedstock also matters. So most of what we call charcoal is low temperature produced, and so you're going to have different properties. Different aromatics are going to be driven off. Different other compounds are going to be driven off at that low temperature versus the high temperature pyrolysis. And I can definitely connect you to someone who knows much more about it beyond that explanation. So I think people use things and use words that are similar to each other when they should be separate. And so some people use different words for the same thing. That's actually why I like to talk about biochar with how it's made versus trying to describe the endpoint first. And of course, my example was using a kiln, which is, sort of human endeavor. But there are, of course, lots of people who are working on trying to sort of pair biochar pellets with heat production. So you would get, sorry, not biochar, so wood pellets. You pellet something, you put it in a sort of closed system or a continuous feed system. You're able to heat your house and you get biochar out. So there's a lot of people, a lot of engineering that's going into some other ways that we can make that high temperature combustion happen and get that really high quality product out versus what you can do in the field. We've been focusing on in the field because we work with agricultural producers, and that's probably more likely at the short term. Great question. Thanks.
One of the reasons I bring it up, and this is, I guess, the second part of that question is, were the applications done on top of each other or were they done separate? So it was the bale feed, the biochar, and the compost, or was it all the same?
They were all in separate places. So yes, so there were like 3 berms, so each berm got one. Yeah, so they were separate. With the caveat that the biochar was treated with a compost tea, so it had that microbial inoculation already, but it wasn't the actual like physical adding compost on top. Because yeah, there are so many ways to treat biochar. There are so many ways to make compost. There's like the fungal dominated composts, there's the bacterial dominated composts. We were going with, again, how would we implement this at a large scale? What do we have available? And then there's so much more space to explore beyond that.
For sure, for sure. I'd love to talk to you a little bit more about the biochar. My only concern with the biochar is I worked on a project once where we ended up spraying a pre-emergent, and then the customer changed their mind. So we came in with an activated charcoal, sprayed it on the crop, harvested the crop, and reseeded, and it absorbed the pre-emerge. And so my concern would be with the biochar, is there a chance that it could absorb the nutrient, that it could absorb and hold nutrients rather than release them?
Yes, I think, and that was what I was hinting at. I am super curious about whether we could use that property for good. Right? Like if you had, like, let's go with a riparian area that you had to clear out a woody species, you've super disturbed that soil, you've opened up the canopy, you may have now created really favorable conditions for a noxious weed. Like what if we could put raw biochar down and suck up those nutrients and slow down the invasion of the noxious one and favor the slower growing native one? But that is so far totally in my mind, have not tested that yet. If anyone wants to write a grant with me, let's do it.
Thank you.
Yeah, but I think that's a really good point. And actually, stay tuned. I can't remember when Kelpie's or when the biochar webinar is. Tomorrow? Tomorrow. So yes, save that question. Those people will know a lot more. Yes, great. Oh, hi, Katie.
Yeah, I was really curious to hear your presentation. So glad to have been on. I did get pulled away for a sidebar task, and so I might have missed this mention on the interactions with monsoon. I saw the mention there at the last about the wind and how it played within these three projects. So curious about the intensity of the monsoon and the timing of the project relative to monsoon.
Oh man, it was rough. So we were, as part of this grant, we were hosting workshops and sort of showcasing what had happened. And one of our sites kept being like, you can have a workshop here, but it has just been sitting on the ground. Nothing has happened. And so we, luckily for that person's sanity, I think there was a late monsoon and the weeds really responded. Let's see, other things related to that precipitation regime. The compost holds snow longer than the surrounding soil. So that was really interesting. So it's definitely holding so much moisture that the snow is persisting longer. So that of course doesn't help if you don't get snow, which I think only one site really noticed that this time. And then anecdotally, one of the sites certainly had material migrate down slope with a large rain event. Again, I'm really glad that we had already sited them really far away from riparian areas, so it wasn't moving. But part of me is like, well, that's kind of interesting. It's like, again, we don't have to treat the whole thing. In some cases, if you put it on a slope, gravity and the water movement is going to help you move around the landscape. Yeah, let's see. Anything else about the timing of monsoon? I mean, I guess it just related to wind. It still responded, even though it had just been sort of sitting and baking the rest of the time. It was like, it was ready when the rains came, the seed bank responded. Because a comment yesterday is we were sort of worried about, especially if the compost just super dries out and gets hydrophobic, are we actually going to create something harmful? So far, we didn't see that, where maybe that first rainfall event was harder to infiltrate, but it did get in there. And like I said, in one case, the tumbleweeds really responded. In other cases, actually, I mean, that's dominantly what we've seen. The annual species, of course, really like the added nutrients, really like, yeah, they're just able to respond to that pulse more quickly than the native species are, which is true of everything.
Yeah, thanks. Curious note on the snow.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's super cool. And like, especially when we were very careful to put like perfect squares out. Like, oh look, there's a perfect square of snow in the middle of the field. It's really neat. Yeah. All right, Randy's working on an aerated static system. Excellent. Yep, in approximately 6 months in Colorado. Yeah, the Reunity Resources has it down to 90 days, start to finish. So it's possible. Cool. Great. Oh, let's see. Bale Grazing. Oh, great. One of the most best soil organic. Oh, excellent. Okay, Randy, do you want to come off and talk more about Bale Grazing in your experience? Otherwise, no pressure. You're welcome to. Oh, can't unmute. No worries. Okay, I'll just read it. Been bale grazing for about 7 years in the small goat dairy through the winter. Soil tests and cover crops and growing season grazing are showing the best soil organic matter improvement over the past 4 years. Awesome. Awesome. And I totally get that bale grazing is expensive. I totally understand that. It's probably not going to be for everyone, but if we can see really big impacts, and especially if there's some funding, for example, something like the Healthy Soil Program that can help people weather that bump or that dip in productivity or that cost, then we can have some better outcomes eventually.
I got a couple more for you. Will you guys have your hard copy handbooks on soil health and things like that at the conference for purchase?
We sure will.
Yes.
I don't think the biochar one will be, well, I know it won't be printed by then. I'm hoping that we'll have a PDF or something soon, but yeah, the other ones are for sure going to be at the conference. Yay.
Nice. Then the other question I have, did anybody report any interaction with their livestock, their horses, their goats, or their cattle with the biochar? I know when we put humus, they get into that and eat it and spread it everywhere. So I'm wondering how they interacted with the biochar.
Yeah, no, people didn't note the biochar. The compost, I think, because it's smellier, even though it's been processed, it just has an odor. They seem to be more curious about the compost than the biochar, but of course there are the people who are feeding it to the cattle on purpose and using that to spread it around. As far as I know, and I was on a conversation and don't have firsthand experience with this, it's not sort of allowed by whatever governing body. You're not supposed to do that at this point, but there are people who are trying it. So yes, and how it interacts with the rumen and all of that is a different kind of scientist's expertise. Yeah, but I think no one noticed any ill effects. I mean, that's again where like knowing your feedstock. Same with buying hay. You want to buy your hay from someone reliable. You don't want moldy hay. Same with compost. You want to make sure it's fully cooked, that there's not going to be pathogens that you're spreading around into new places, or weed seeds. And so, yeah, that 131.5 for 3 days minimum and that sort of thing is going to be really important.